Thank you, everybody. Dr. Kim, always a pleasure to see you and learn from you. And welcome to all of you global citizens. What an important time it is in the world to be a global citizen. 10 years ago, talking to a group like this, we'd have thought, that's great. You're open-minded, you're big thinkers, you're something that the world needs. Now you're absolutely crucial to the success of the world. And Hugh was talking, Dr. Kim, about spending more on poverty alleviation. You at the World Bank have taken to measuring this a different way. Spending more is important, but how you spend has become critical, regardless of where you are on the ideological spectrum. There are some on the right who don't want more public money spent on things, and there are some on the left who feel that more should be spent. You would rather measure the outcome on human capital for money spent. So we're not talking about infrastructure, roads and buildings and things like that, which is something you do talk about, but your energy today and something you're doing at the World Bank is about human capital, coming together to agree on how to measure human capital and how to deploy resources so as to enhance human capital. Tell us a bit about this.
Well, thanks, Ali. And I don't know when you started calling me Dr. Kim. Please call me...
About a minute and a half ago.
Yeah.
But it has a nice ring to it.
We're old friends, almost family friends. Ali's cousin is one of my closest friends. Anyway, so this is the message that I especially want to give to global citizens. Look, you guys have already had a huge impact. Global citizens had a huge impact. You're holding people's feet to the fire. But the question is, for what? What are we holding people's feet to the fire for? And for so long, and look, I have been a huge part of it. I mean, I spent so much of my adult life, a really good chunk of my adult life, arguing for the greater generosity of donors around health and education. And that's good. I mean, we succeeded. 20 million people in Africa on HIV treatment. It's had a transformative impact. It wouldn't have happened without the generosity, but frankly, of people like George W. Bush and others. It wouldn't have happened. But now, we're in a very different situation. And the different situation is this. Everyone, all 8 billion people on the planet are going to have access to broadband by 2025 or so. And they probably all will either own a smartphone or have friends who own smartphones, so they'll be able to see what's happening in the rest of the world, which means aspirations are going up. And the Sustainable Development Goals are very important. At first I thought, my God, these are so huge. There's 17 of them. They cover so many different areas. But that's about what everyone in the world by 2025 or so will aspire to. They will want all those things. So how do we get there? And I just came to the conclusion that no matter how generous donors are, we'll never get to the place we need to be, which is that everyone has an equal opportunity to be able to compete and thrive in the system that exists today, which is a global market system. Now, I thought long and hard about this because we're the largest donors to education. Not donors. I mean, they're very low interest loans, and we're also one of the largest providers of support for health. But it doesn't even touch what's really needed, and you have a situation where there is a crisis in human capital. Human capital is just we use that term human capital because finally we're now trying to measure a country's wealth in terms of not only its productive capital, but its human capital and its natural capital. This is something that climate change has helped us to do. Now it's not just what can you produce, but how well are your people doing? How are you managing your natural resources? And so now that we have that, it's a way that I'm using to talk to ministers of finance. They understand it when I say, what's the status of your human capital? And it turns out that the crisis is very severe. Throughout Africa, childhood stunting is very high, on average about 30%. And that's 30% of your future workforce that will not most likely be able to compete in the digital economy of the future. India, 38%, Indonesia, 37%, Pakistan, 45%. These countries are facing a crisis because not only are the children stunted, but their educational systems are not up to speed. And so what's going to happen to the 38% of children in India who go through school systems that are not adequate, and then when they become 2025, they see that the low-skilled agriculture and manufacturing jobs are gone to automation? What are they going to do? And so there is an urgency here, and so I decided that we need to change the ballgame. We need to not just continue to work with, to pressure donors to give more, but we have to change the focus of responsibility and get heads of state and ministers of finance, the real decision makers, heads of state and heads of government, to fear not investing more effectively in health and education. So we're doing something called the Human Capital Index. It's going to be controversial, but I found that unless you actually rank people or rank countries, often they don't pay attention. We've written article after article after article about the importance of investing in health and education, and so many heads of state and government and ministers of finance play along with the narrative that I've been a part of. They say, well, you know, if the donors would just be more generous, we'd spend more on health and education. In the meantime, their outcomes are terrible and they're in trouble. So this index is coming out on October 11th. Please watch for it, because as activists, this is going to be, I hope, an important tool for you to hold leaders in every country to account. And some countries are going to really not like where they come out. They're going to come out ranked below countries that they've always felt superior to. Right? And there's going to be, I hope, intense discussions in those countries about how did we get here? How did we get to a place where we're not going, where our children are not going to be able to compete in the future?
So these are a lot of young people here. They know and like lists. Look, there are lists about the best places in the world to work, or the best place where your money goes the most, or the quality of life indexes, or ease of doing business indexes. So these become important when done by organizations like yours. But what I think is important is you're not ranking people on countries on how much they spend, or even what proportion of the GDP. You gave me examples of some countries like America, which spend much more than the developed world average on health care. And some could argue that we could spend less and be much more efficient.
That's right.
There are some countries that spend a much smaller percentage of their GDP on, and again, I'm using healthcare as an example, and have remarkable outcomes. So you're measuring outcomes.
Absolutely.
How a country chooses to get there, how they choose to tax, how they choose to deliver is a different issue.
Right. Well, we could have, at first we had 15, 20, 30 different outcomes that we could have included in the Human Capital Index, but we didn't have enough data so that we could defend every single ranking that we made. So we just focused on the things that we are very confident about. Because the first thing that people do when they're ranked below where they think they should be ranked is they question the methodology. So there are just four things. One, there's been a revolution in our ability to understand what children are actually learning. So we know that a year of school in Malawi, for example, is about the equivalent of 0.44 years of school, or 0.32 years of school in Singapore. So because we know by the testing scores. So we have one index which is called learning adjusted years of schooling. And so Singapore's 1, and everyone else is a percentage of 1. We know stunting data, because it's easy. You measure how tall kids are. And so we have childhood stunting data. We also know a lot about under 5 childhood mortality. That's the third. And the fourth is just adult mortality from all causes, which again, we have really good information on that. So those 4 turn out to be extremely highly correlated with economic growth looking backwards. Among the highest correlations looking backwards that we've seen. And so you can only assume that because of automation, AI, robotics, that correlation is going to become even stronger going forward.
So that's the argument.
That's the argument.
That's the argument is if fix these, we'll rank you, and if you do better, your outcomes are going to be better.
Your outcomes are going to get better.
Your economic outcomes are going to be better.
Your economic outcomes are going to be better. But what will really happen is that we'll start a conversation. It's not just young people who like lists, journalists like lists. And journalists like lists that are easy to understand.
That's right.
And so we're making it easy to understand, and yet completely defendable. And so what I hope happens among global citizens is that that continue to really push donors to give more, but also push donors to give more strategically so that the outcomes get better, right?
So the country that ranks better is likely to get more donor participation because the ROI is better, the return is better.
But it could be that the countries that are ranked worst, and what we're hoping to do is just focus on the countries that are in the biggest trouble. But then what we'll say to the donors is, you can make all kinds of new pledges, but if the outcomes don't get better, they're not going to move up the list.
Right.
So we're going to have a different conversation,
right.
which is, look, let's only do things based on outcomes. I mean, let me just give you an example. We changed some of the way that we give loans now. That instead of giving loans up front and saying do the program, which one might call a very supply-driven approach, we now only we empower countries to do this. The health and education systems is called the Program for Results. It's P for R. You can think the P for R is literally paying for results. Only if you get results does the government give money to the health system
right.
or the education system. It has had a revolutionary impact, really much, much better outcomes. And so we know actually how to do it, but we've got to stop this right now. And I participated in this, and so I take some portion of the blame on this. But so far, it's been about the generosity of donors and not about the outcomes so children can urgently get on the path of being able to compete in the economy of the future. I think, along with climate change, I think this question of enormously, the rapidly rising aspirations without the opportunity that would go with it is one of the biggest problems that all young people will face. This is not a world that you want to live in where you have 30, 40% of the entire population of large countries angry that they're not able to participate and have a life like you guys have.
When Hugh introduced me, he mentioned that I was born in Kenya, which is very interesting because we've had a U.S. president born in Kenya, so that's why it's so popular. But you were born in Korea, and Korea is instructive in if one takes this seriously, the turnaround can happen.
Yeah. So when I was born in Korea, so my team always does this to me, right? When I was born in Korea in 1959, the World Bank would not give a loan to Korea. Korea was the rural part of the peninsula. The mineral wealth and the industrial capacity was in the north. And so the World Bank literally said, Korea is too hopeless to receive a World Bank loan. So it wasn't until 1963 that the money started flowing from the first loan from the World Bank, and that was for a road. And the second loan for the World Bank happened a few years later, and that was for education. And Korea was ridiculed for taking its second loan for education. What are you thinking, right? So, of course, everyone knows the story of Korea. Korea actually went through all the stages of industrialization that are the classic ones, and from agriculture to light manufacturing to heavy industry. But in 1959, it was thought to be a hopeless case. 20% literacy in the late 1940s. 20% literacy in Korea. And so this focus on health and education was critical to Korea, and all of these things happened. But lots of African countries now say to me, we're going to go through the path of Korea. We're going to go from agriculture to light manufacturing to heavy industry. But in fact, that path is probably closed to them. And that path is probably closed to them because of automation, AI. In Bangladesh, where it's the most efficient and low-cost garment manufacturing industry in the world, the owners of the Bangladeshi garment factories are buying robots. They're called SOBots, S-E-W bots, right? And so, if they're buying SOBots, what's the likelihood of that industry then moving to Africa? I don't think it's very high. So if the last industries that were supposed to be, human being intensive, garments and shoes now they're 3D printing, right? So if that's the case, what are people going to do? Well, if you give them education and healthcare, make sure they're not stunted, they'll decide what they're going to do. You guys will come up with new stuff to do. But if they don't have those basic inputs, I think we're going to have instability.
We have a question that came into our Facebook page from Renee, who is a global citizen from Delaware, who asks, how does in your human capital agenda, how do you make sure that governments prioritize prevention over response, particularly in healthcare and education?
Well, so I hear the question. Prevention is really important. But the thing is, guys, we have to be less ideological and more evidence-based, right? So prevention is really important, yes. But on what? What do you mean on prevention? Preventing the spread of HIV is actually treating HIV, right? We know that. Preventing the spread of tuberculosis is actually treating tuberculosis. So, ideas like prevention is better than cure, let's be really specific. And I think the bigger question is, okay, so if you want to have the maximum impact on your healthcare system, what are the investments that you want to make? And, we would say things like, well, community health workers have been always shown to be extremely helpful, and you get a 2-for-1. You get a formal labor pool that learns how to work in a formal job. They then move on to other jobs. You get much better outcomes because often it's adherence to regimes that are difficult, and you also have a relatively low-cost way of improving your outcomes quickly. Community health workers will be critical in going up the human capital index because that's how we'll decrease stunting, that's how we'll decrease child mortality, and for so many causes of mortality, it's actually adherence to regimens as opposed to fancy surgeries. Mm-hmm. So there's a great possibility of killing two birds with one stone. More good jobs for poor people and better outcomes. So let's be evidence-based, not ideological. I won't come in and say, do prevention instead of treatment. Come on, let's be more specific, right? So this is one of the really important lessons. Guys, we've got to be much more evidence-based than ideological, right? This happened in medicine. When I was going through my training, evidence-based medicine only really became a thing in the early 1980s. But now, we have to do development on the basis of evidence, and so much of development is still very ideological. So yes, treatment's better than cure, but in what sense and where? Let's be specific.
Okay, so evidence versus ideology is an interesting question that speaks to your history because you were an activist, and you also draw distinctions between intentions and results. So this Human Capital Index talks about outcomes. It talks about results. We're in a world where we talk a lot right now about intention. Mm-hmm. How do you square those?
Well, I would say that right now for the developing countries that we're trying to talk to with this Human Capital Index, one is that you cannot hide behind accusing donors of not being generous enough. You cannot hide behind making proclamations of more spending to come. You can't even hide behind spending more if you don't get your outcomes to improve. And so I think for us at the World Bank Group, as a multilateral organization, the most important thing we can do is to help create incentives that will allow leaders to decide on what path, it's up to them how they get there. But at the end of the day, they're going to have to get the better outcomes one way or another, right? So the more we can do that, I think the more we can move away from ideological debates and questions of intent.
Are you in a position, having seen everything you've seen in your activist life, in your medical life, in your academic life, in your World Bank life, to be able to say, you can get there any way you want, these ways work better than these ways?
Yeah, I mean, so, here, what we do now is, and what I offer to any head of state or any minister of finance is, look, you have a set of problems, and it could be policy reform, it could be corruption, and we don't know what the right answer is. You probably have a better idea of what the right answer is, but what we'll do for you is we'll bring people from all over the world who have actually dealt with the exact same problem in another country. We'll explain to you how we attack the problem, either successfully or unsuccessfully, and then you choose. You choose from the different ways that we've approached the problem, and then make your commitment and move. Same thing with health and education. There's not one solution to issues, but we also ask them not to be ideological. We ask them not to be ideological, public versus private. We ask them to focus on the outcomes for kids. What's the best way to get the best outcomes for kids? Or we ask them not to be ideological, teachers' unions or not, or whatever. I mean, look, I'm a supporter of unions, but at the end of the day, it's not about the unions, it's about the kids' outcomes, right? And so how are we going to get the best outcomes for kids? As long as they focus on that, and by the way, our Human Capital Index is absolutely agnostic about how they get there. It's just, are the kids learning more?
Right. Are you measuring it? So when you look at the results of the Human Capital Index, which is yet to come out, are they going to parallel things like the Human Development Index or things like the Ease of Doing Business? I mean, in other words, does it tend to fall into, do countries tend to fall into baskets of good governance versus messy governance?
Well, so we don't do rankings of governance, right? So it's, boy, talk about a third rail. We don't, we're actually...
I'll rephrase it to make it simple. What my point is, when you do some things right, is it easier to do the human capital stuff right?
So without giving things away, you know, the rankings are pretty consistent, right? But because we're so specific, there are going to be differences.
Okay.
So the top 5 performers on a Human Development Index are going to show up somewhere, you know, high on our Human Capital Index. But the general rules of thumb, you know, rule of law, good governance, all these things are really important and will continue to be really important in whatever they take on. But, you know, again, for the global citizens, what I'd say is there's the possibility that we can start a very different conversation in every country that is not, you know, where it should be in terms of investing in people. And we need you guys to push that discussion. And you know, Hugh's already moving in the direction. I've been talking to Hugh for a long time about this index, and so that's what's going to, I think, be different. You can't hide behind.
So what numbers. Do these folks do? What can they do to help? You've identified an issue. You've identified what a potential solution can be to some of these human capital issues. You've identified that the gap between, because of the digital world, the gap between where some people are in the world and where they think they can be is possibly greater than it's been.
Yeah.
What do they do to help?
Well, I hope you use the index as strategically as you can to ask really hard questions. I mean, that's what the global citizens have done so well. They've been incredibly good at holding people's feet to the fire. Now we're quantifying it even more. But I'd go further than that. I was at a youth event that UNICEF sponsored yesterday, and it wasn't in my scripted notes, but a thought came to me. And you'll remember, Ali, well, maybe you won't, but in the late '60s, the young people used to say, "Don't trust anybody over 30." Right? And so I would say, on issues, they're going to pull us out on issues like human capital, right? Because it's going to be your future that's affected more than mine. On issues like human capital, on issues like climate change, don't trust anyone over 30 to make the decisions. Put the pressure on so that we do the right thing, because there's plenty of money in the world, and there's even so many ways for developing countries to generate more resources for investing in health and education. There's plenty of money in the world to turn economic development into one that's low carbon and in fact cleaner and brighter than a high carbon future. But most of the people who are making these decisions are over 30. You can't trust us. You guys have. I tell you, my 9-year-old asks me on a regular basis, "Dad, why aren't you doing more about climate change?" Right? We're the largest financiers of climate change activity in the world, right? But he still asks me that question, and he should. He should ask me that. And you guys should take this data that we're producing and ask the hardest questions and keep after people.
Jim, it is always a pleasure to talk to you. I think you should all remember this conversation, because in a few years we're all going to be talking about the Human Capital Index and how countries are going to be achieving more. So remember that you were there at the inception of this. So thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Jim, thanks to you.